Chapter 19. And now for something completely different. Truth bombs. Despite the validity of everything else you will have heard here, you've just reached the most important 2 chapters in the entire book. Although the information that follows is best heard at the tail end of everything else for the full context, these can be taken in isolation and absorbed in their own right. I certainly urge anyone to not stop listening here, or the true nature of everything else they've heard will be lost. And if there's only one section they choose to share with others, I would urge them to make this the one. Having spent the rest of this book looking at so many of the strange things that go on in the music industry and beyond, it's now time to start addressing the why. Any such story that ends without going there is like getting to the final summing up of an Agatha Christie murder mystery and finding the last few pages have been ripped out. I'm going to spend the remaining time sharing with you what I've come to understand. I'll be dispensing with phrases like, I believe that, or it's my opinion at. It'll be pretty clear that this is the case, and to state that every time would detract from the listenability of the information. How anyone chooses to react is of course up to them. A significant part of the human suffering that's endured for so long has been as a result of certain individuals telling everyone else what they must believe. The information will speak for itself anyway, and will resonate with those it's destined to resonate with. As I mentioned at the very start of this book, it is impossible to truly understand the manipulations of the music industry without putting them into the full context of what's really going on in this world, and what this reality is in the first place. The understandable reaction of so many when they come to grudgingly accept the conspiracy is to ask, but what can we do about any of this? It's only an understanding of what follows that offers the empowerment to do anything to counter it. The same could be said in the context of any number of subjects within the truth conspiracy realm. There are many full-time experts on 9/11, for instance, who've taken apart the official version bit by bit and could talk for hours about the many anomalies. The case will be the same with the truth about vaccines, GM food, chemtrails, institutionalised paedophilia, satanic ritual abuse, trauma-based mind control, the list goes on. Each of these may seem like an isolated subject area in its own right, but when you come to understand the bigger picture, it becomes clear how they're all connected and how each of them serves its own purpose within the system, in tandem with all the others. As music is my thing, I've attempted to show with this book how the manipulations of the music industry are just one of these. Many feel overwhelmed by the dark nature of these subjects, reasoning that the control system has been so deeply embedded into our reality for so long that deconstructing it step by step seems impossible. Those of a New Age persuasion, meanwhile, will argue that paying any kind of attention to dark or negative subjects only help to keep them manifested in reality due to the energetic connection that individuals make when applying their conscious attention. This is ultimately a cop-out and an abdication of personal responsibility, since the first step towards resolving any problem has to be understanding the full nature of it, as far as it's possible. Only then can any solution come. And attempting to dismantle the hugely complex and multi-tiered control system brick by brick clearly is impractical. The real solution lies elsewhere. There can surely be no one of an appropriate thinking capacity in the world who hasn't given at least the smallest amount of reflection to the big questions in life. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? What actually is here? What happens when we leave it? Although discussion of such subjects is rarely heard around the water cooler at work, they are enigmas which have puzzled and confounded humanity for millennia, and must surely occupy the thoughts of all people on earth at least occasionally during their solitary quiet time. For as long as I can remember, they've certainly plagued my mind, from the first mentions of Jesus and an undefined entity called God in my primary school days, to my 4 years attending an evangelical Christian church under the delusion that this might bring answers to the strange feelings I started getting at the age of 19, that the world wasn't quite what we'd been led to think it was, to my ultimate departure, disillusioned at not having found the answers, but instead a whole set of new questions. This set me on the path to many years of bitter atheism, genuinely believing that there is no divine plan and that human life is a cosmic accident and the result of pure random chance. As I mentioned at the start, it was around 2008 that this belief system started to crumble in the face of new evidence that was coming my way as to the true nature of this world and the forces that currently have it in their grip. The activities of the dark occult priest class are well documented in the rest of this book. The power that they've been able to exert over humanity has only been possible through their deeply studied understanding of the profound nature of reality. What it all comes down to is the fact that everything in creation, animals, plants, mountains, humans, is made up of the same universal energy vibrating at different frequencies. In its base form, everything is this energy. It's each expression's unique vibratory pattern that gives it its form in the apparently physical realm. And I say apparently physical because what we understand to be the solid world only appears that way because of how we, as consciously aware beings, interpret and decode the energetic patterns that we experience. I'm under no illusion as to how bizarre or unfeasible that information sounds when it's encountered for the first time, and I was in lasting denial of it myself when I first came across it. But there are many, many researchers, authors and scholars from many different ages and walks of life and from civilizations in all corners of the world and all corroborating each other's information who can explain the whole phenomenon way better than any soundbite version can. This understanding is also the basis of many of the religions and belief systems of cultures from all over the ancient world, before many of these great truths got corrupted and deliberately occulted by the institutionalized religions that we see at work in the world today. It's not for nothing that the word religion is derived from the Latin word ligare, meaning to bind or tie back. You can also see this great truth about the nature of our reality encoded into popular movies in the form of allegory. The original Matrix is one of the most frequently quoted examples. Beneath its surface gloss and CGI action sequences lies the revelation that what we think of as physical reality is actually electrical and digital information waves, which get decoded into reality by our minds acting as receivers and transmitters. In other words, the world only exists this way because we perceive it to be so. Without observers in place to decode the information, everything would remain in its base form as energetic information codes. It occurred to me a while back that this must be the origin of the often heard phrase, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? These seemingly nonsensical phrases don't come about by accident. When I came to my ultimate acceptance of this great truth, it had the opposite effect of the previous belief systems that I'd embraced. It answered more questions than it raised. Only the understanding that this apparent reality, and all others, are expressions of energy resonating to different frequency patterns can explain the concept of timeless eternity, the survival of spirit souls after death, reincarnation, out-of-body and near-death experiences, remote viewing and astral projection, and even the relatively trivial phenomenon of premonitions and déjà vu. The atheistic Darwinian view that the world is basically a cold, heartless rock floating in space and that we're mere biological entities that just happen to have mutated out of nothingness against all the odds is another cop-out. It's a religion for habitual skeptics, and is there as an alternative to all the man-made, mind-controlling religions of the world to keep humanity away from the real truth of our existence. If they can't get you with rigid, superstitious dogma, they get you with the opposite, absolute denial of anything vaguely spiritual or esoteric. Imagine then that a small section of the human population, back in the mists of prehistory, had come to understand that the universe works in this way and, devoid of the normal characteristics that prevent most of us from acting in such a way, known as conscience, had decided that they could gain a tactical advantage over the rest of the population by putting their knowledge to work, while deliberately keeping the rest of humanity in complete ignorance through an assortment of malevolent efforts. If we assume these individuals to not have humanity's best interests at heart and to be ruled by a psychopathic mindset, we can start to see how this is going to spell a pretty raw deal for everyone else. This is the dynamic that's been at play in our world for thousands of years, and the conditions we find ourselves living in during these times are as a direct long-term consequence of this process. It's only a psychopathic approach to the world that could keep a control system formed on this basis in place for as long as it has been. Most people, when thinking of psychopaths, have visions of the Norman Bates character in the Hitchcock movie or a knife-wielding, frenzied serial killer from some teen slasher flick. But this is a caricature of the extreme end of psychopathy. For the most part, it's determined simply by a complete lack of empathy and compassion towards other beings, and an inability to understand or care about the impact that your actions might have for the rest of creation. A psychopath can quite happily give the order for a village full of women and children in some far-off land to be slaughtered in a drone bomb attack and sleep like a baby that very night without a single troubling thought. The world's governments are full of them, and not by accident. A very small proportion of the human population, between 1 and 5%, depending on which researcher you listen to, are reckoned to be primary psychopaths. They're born this way, with the section of the brain that gives rise to compassion and empathy broken and dysfunctional. It's a mental illness, and at its primary level, it cannot be cured. Secondary psychopathy, meanwhile, is a condition that can be programmed or cultivated into an individual, usually from early childhood. Growing up in a family or social environment which is characterized by psychopathy, in conjunction with suffering personal abuse and trauma oneself, can bring about a psychopathic approach to the world. These are the methods that the controlling elites use on their own children to produce the type of mindset that will be needed for a lifetime spent serving the system and oppressing the rest of humanity. Psychologists say that this level of psychopathy can actually be reversed and cured, however, if an individual is taken out of this type of conditioning early enough, and if there's some level of personal will on their part to break free of it. And there are examples of many who have done this. Exiting the asylum. Over the years, phrases such as conspiracy theorist and tinfoil hat-wearing nutjob have been created to dismiss anyone questioning the official line as a wide-eyed, unhinged lunatic. Exercising the ability to think for yourself and asserting your individuality have been made a social crime. And because the majority of people are constantly seeking the approval of others and trying to fit in to a world that has deliberately been made insane, they play ball and act in line with normal behaviour, not wishing to step out of the security and comfort zone of the box. It becomes clear then that understanding great truths, then taking on the responsibility to communicate what you've learnt to others, can never be possible for anyone still stuck in that systematic mindset. Anyone wishing to embark on a path towards true knowledge and understanding, and therefore freedom, has to first let go of any concern of what others might think of them for what they do, say, or think. Most people are shackled by worries of what the blokes down the pub might think if they stop talking about football and start speaking about the mysteries of life and reality, or what their mum and dad or partner might think, or what their boss at work will say. Fear of becoming a social outcast is what keeps so many silent and inactive about information that needs to be put out there as widely as possible if humanity is ever to break free of the slavery and servitude that's been imposed on us. Overcoming this is certainly a difficult process for most that come to truth, and I know this from personal experience. Burning those first bridges is always the most difficult step. As you start to speak out, you realise that the paths back to your previous way of life are disappearing and that the only way now is forwards. It didn't take long until I reached the stage where I no longer gave a shit about what anyone may think of me for what I was starting to say, however, and for that which I instinctively knew to be true. I couldn't be writing or speaking this book if it was any other way. A way of thinking which certainly helped me to overcome any worry about how people might perceive me was to consider what anyone actually gets in exchange for worrying what their mate or sister or dad or colleague or some random stranger might think of them. In each case, the value that you draw from censoring what you say or modifying the way you act for fear of how it might go down with somebody else is exactly the same. Absolutely nothing. No value or benefit at all. Why then do we do it? Another way I like to look at it all is I've never appreciated being taken for a mug. And who really does? Who can honestly say they enjoy the idea of being duped, of being treated by others as a chump, of someone else considering them so dumb and ignorant and stupid that they can feed them a constant crock of lies, disinformation and deception, knowing they'll lap it all up like an unthinking moron? Not me, thanks. Yet this is what's going on in the world. Every day, the bulk of humanity is spoon-fed lies by the corporate-controlled mainstream media, by the professional paid liars in government, and by those in other aspects of the establishment. All these lies can be proven to be such by the application of critical thought and evidence-based research. Yet most choose to commit absolutely none of their time, through free will choice, to looking into such matters, and remain too afraid to talk about it to friends, family, neighbours and colleagues. Well, I'd like to let people know about human slavery and about how our thoughts and perceptions are not our own and about how things are never going to get any better for any of us until there's a massive shift in awareness of these things and a huge change in human behaviour and thought as a result. But whatever would the lads at the job think? Who, honestly, can look at the world we live in and think it to be normal or sane? A world where human labour is exploited in the form of taxes, stolen by an institution called government, on the premise that it's needed to help maintain the infrastructure of the land. Although the truth of it is that much is covertly siphoned off to fund some foreign war or other. A world where such taxation methods are only necessary in the first place because, instead of printing and circulating money themselves, the governments of the world commission cartels of private bankers operating under such names as the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England to loan the government money with debt automatically attached, obliging the government to use the energy and the labour of the people as collateral against the loan. Then, when more money is needed to pay off the debts that come with each new transaction, the banking cartels issue new money with yet more debt attached, meaning there's never enough money in circulation to pay off the accrued debts, and in turn that there will always be those in society that will go bankrupt and lose money, property and land. It's built into the very fabric of the system that this is the case. And yet people accept this with no fuss as normal, just the way it is. And anyone suggesting that it might be in humanity's best interests if we found a new way to do things is written off as a nutter or a conspiracy theorist. If this is sane, I'm very happy to remain in nutter territory, thanks all the same. How can anyone truly justify one family sitting on sickening, colossal levels of wealth purely as a result of their genetics and expecting the rest of the population to be servile to them? How many question what royal even means in the first place? What excuse can there be for hundreds of thousands in the very land they claim to reign over, living in shocking levels of poverty and hardship that could be eradicated overnight if the wealth were distributed fairly, in line with humanity, compassion and straight common sense, rather than being tied up in gold-plated carriages, pointless regalia and other mindless expressions of pomp and grandeur that benefit no one except the soulless parasites that are permitted to use them? The Queen of England, Not that there's anything remotely English about the whole Saxe-Coburg, Gotha and Battenberg bloodlines that pass themselves off under the stolen name of Windsor, of course, is so obscenely rich that she's reckoned to own what equates to around a sixth of the Earth, including seabeds that lie underneath oceans. How can any one human being, a status which is debated by some, own a seabed, for fuck's sake? Or any other natural resource on the Earth, for that matter, which in reality is freely and abundantly available to all who occupy the Earth for the few decades that they're in their bodies, before it falls under the custody of the next generation. Another expression of pure insanity when you really get down to the grassroots of it. And another which is not only tolerated, but is actively propped up and allowed to continue by so many of the very people it exists to enslave and exploit so contemptuously. Witness the hordes of brainwashed morons waving their plastic flags and queuing for hours to catch a glimpse of the figurehead of a system that's enslaving them and their families. That's sane? I'll stay crazy, please. Who, outside of the realms of the propaganda and hyperbole that's peddled in its favour, can really offer any kind of moral justification for war? Who, apart from career military men or psychopathic politicians with a salary to earn and an agenda to serve, have you ever met who wanted a war? Who thought that killing and mutilating other people and causing unending ripples of human suffering was a reasonable, sensible and justifiable way of resolving a conflict? And yet we're conditioned from the earliest age to meekly accept that war is an inevitable byproduct of human nature, that we're tribal beings that just can't get along, and that we're inherently warlike and aggressive in our nature. Don't forget to support our boys in their latest foreign conquest. We live in a society of double standards where if an everyday civilian picked up a machine gun and slaughtered a group of women and children in cold blood, they would, quite rightly, be branded a dangerous criminal and incarcerated or executed depending on the state or the country in question. Yet when a military soldier, soul dyer, or increasingly now a cop, does the same, this act of straight murder can be written off as collateral damage involving casualties of war. And the perpetrator will not only escape justice, but is highly likely to be decorated for bravery or service in the line of duty. We hear constantly of the war on cancer, as promoted by the many, many charities in this field. One day we'll beat cancer, they say. But it always comes with the proviso that to do so, they need money from the general public on a never-ending basis. Lots of it. When cancer charities have been working on finding a cure for well over 50 years, you have to ask yourself where exactly all that money is going when the cure never seems to appear. The truth is that the majority of the funds go towards making the senior executives of these charities very, very rich. As difficult as it is for people to come to terms with, sadly, it turns out that many cancer charities are a money-making scam, cynically manipulating the good nature of well-meaning people by dangling the ever-present carrot of hope. The last thing this organised racket wants is to find a cure for cancer. That would put hundreds of thousands of employees out of business and deprive the pharmaceutical industry of millions of customers every year, along with the huge profits they generate through conventional treatment. The truth is that natural cures for cancer have always existed. Nature provides the remedies for all human ailments, usually in the form of the appropriate plant medicine correctly administered. This is knowledge that has been understood for millennia by the shaman and priest doctors of indigenous populations around the world. You know, the very same shaman and priest doctors that have been mercilessly slaughtered by the colonialism that's ravaged so many civilizations, destroying their culture and knowledge in their wake. Isn't it interesting, given that cannabis is cited as the principal alternative cure, that it's demonized in Western society as a dangerous drug that's illegal to cultivate, whereas pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines loaded with toxic ingredients like mercury and formaldehyde are absolutely fine. How could this be in a situation where governments care about people and represent their interests? Can any world where this sort of thing happens be judged as sane? Clearly not, I'd suggest. And yet it goes on being tolerated by most without a second thought towards the sheer injustice and madness of it all. The brainwashed state of low-level consciousness that we're manipulated into from birth, and which few ever take it upon themselves to break out of, was communicated with poetic brilliance in a 2015 Facebook post by Rickard Lagnevall. It's hard to know how to express this great truth any more effectively than this. He says, "In a materialistic, westernised country of choice, a young boy cries out loud to express his great anguish because, for reasons beyond his comprehensive ability, he cannot have that big red toy located in a large Toys R Us. His mother says he can have this yellow toy instead, but it's so small compared to that toy, and thusly he displays his emotions in the most natural manner available to him. The tears of disapproval fall seemingly unending in quantity. To no avail does the mother tell the boy to be silent. She says it's not a matter requiring tears. But why should he be silent? He's sad and he must therefore express it so that he can move beyond it. In her unconsciously accepted shame, she angrily commands him to be silent. Although this proves to be an equally futile act, his tears continue to fall. The boy simply cannot understand. After all, there are so many toys here. Why can't he have that red toy? Why are all these toys here if not to be played with? Why must he be silent when he's sad? Why is his mother now angry at him? His tears are starting to give way to shock and confusion. Strangers passing by the mother and her boy stop in their paths to whisper to each other while pointing their fingers, something that the mother almost instinctively responds to by grasping the boy's arm firmly and inflicting slight pain as she threatens him with not receiving any toy at all unless he stops his crying and sobbing. And of course, at this outlook, the boy mentally musters up all the force he can in an effort to stop the tears. The only sound remaining to break the silence is intermittent snivelling as he assumes mental posture and looks around at the people, now quickly losing interest, as there's no longer anyone upsetting the status quo. The boy records everything, yet in his conscious mind he can understand none of it. As the years go on and he grows older, he learns that displaying emotions is largely frowned upon in this society. And during his years in school, he also learns that questioning authority is duly forbidden, as the authority will punish you for such transgressions. In his teens, the boy is introduced to different ways of intoxicating himself. He habituates smoking, as it relieves his worries by granting slight sensory stimuli, blatantly disregarding all the long-term potential hazards outweighed by the instant gratification. He grows up to become a mediocre man, taught to keep most of his opinions to himself and do what he's told. He eventually marries a woman who doesn't demand too much from him, and he drudges through the work weeks of the year, only really looking forward to the next weekend and its subsequent pleasures of intoxicating himself to a sufficient degree as to forget his worries, and to numb the ever-growing pain in the furthest reaches of his being. The boy is now a man, his life as inconspicuous and insignificant as any of his fellow colleagues or friends. One week is merely replaced by another. The joy that used to arrive every weekend is now scarcely available, but more than once a year during the first few days of vacation. It's at this point that he completely loses all outlook on life. He succumbs to a deep and dark place wherein years of suppressed emotions haunt him in every waking moment. The strength of his mind is shattered under the sheer force of the emotional re-emergence, and his life falls asunder. He seeks help from society in how to handle these emotions, but the modern Inquisition under the guise of psychology does not exist to alleviate the issues created by the societal norms in the first place. It's only meant to assure that the people are able to work another week, and thusly he receives no actual assistance. He's given one drug after another, all of which numb his mind and essentially remove the sensations elicited from his suppressed emotions. But he continues taking them because he's learnt not to disobey authority and to do what he's been told. At this point, the man is largely dead. He's still able to perform within his monotonous work, but all of life has lost its colours. The taste across his palate is bland, and he no longer has a mind with which to worry. His spinal column is left to live out the remaining years of his so-called ordinary life. And one day he's found dead in his favourite chair. Is this really what we want? And so it becomes clear that a major change in the human mindset, brought about by a radical shift in consciousness, is needed if this reality is ever to come close to being a just and moral place to live. Losing the fear of what others might think is the first change that has to happen on a major scale. But an understanding of the moral laws of the universe on a scale that rivals the knowledge that's been hoarded by the dark occultists who have held humankind in slavery for so long is also essential.